Not written because I am allegedly bitter at having lost some traffic cases. If someone does consider me bitter, so what? Such uninformed opinion does not affect the truth. If you were mugged, wouldn't you be bitter? Does that magically relieve the mugger of responsibility? If people were not bitter, lawyers would be out of a profession, wouldn't they? I'll flip this argument around. Is it an offense to a traffic ticket to claim the cop is just bitter? Because of what I have learned, I personally have no political beliefs. I define politics as organized violence and deception. I believe forcing my opinions on others is wrong, whether I directly or indirectly through what I call political voting. I believe that while I have the right to use my property as I see fit, I have no right to tell other people how to use their own property or interfere with their free use of it. I am not impressed by political pecking orders, and I don't think it's necessary to initiate the use of violence. I also believe that no service, however valuable it may allegedly be, should be provided at the barrel of a gun. A service is proven valuable by the number of people willing to voluntarily pay for it. Just because you drive a Dodge doesn't mean I have to. In other words, just because you may feel the need to be dominated by another person such as a governor, doesn't mean I want or need to also. If you need a king, that's your prerogative. However, your choice to shop at Sears doesn't obligate me to contribute a fair share of their operating expenses, and if I don't, it doesn't mean I have to leave the geographic area I choose to live in, i.e. Sears, love it or leave it. The thought of how far the human race would have advanced without government simply staggers the imagination. Doug Casey, 1979. Chapter 1. Know who you're dealing with. One of my favorite lines from the movie The Untouchables is spoken by Sean Connery. There's an intruder in his house seeking to kill him, and he says, just like a Dago to bring a knife to a gunfight. If I don't know who and what I'm dealing with, then I can't be very effective if I choose to defend against a bureaucratic attack. What is critical to understanding who and what I am dealing with is this. Bureaucrats never ask permission to aggress against someone or their property. I know you may laugh at this, but this simple truth should not be overlooked because this is the basis of the most effective method of exposing their proceedings for what they really are. If you think of bureaucrats are a benevolent group of caring, peace-loving individuals who respect the property rights of others, then ask a bureaucrat if they require your permission to proceed against you. They will tell you in no uncertain terms they do not. In my experience, some bureaucrats will actually laugh if they think I am suggesting their jobs depend on my freely given consent. This, however, is the reaction I hope to get. Let him pound his chest at what a man he is by not having to ask my permission to control my life and my property. I never underestimate the importance of this issue because it's the only real issue. I'm dealing with men and women who take control, also known as jurisdiction, over people's lives and property without their consent and are usually very proud of it. In other words, they acquire control over your life and property through violence and organized coercion. Why is this so important? Do you equate violence with good faith? I don't. Unlike bureaucrats in places like China, bureaucrats in the geographic area known as the United States put up a pretense of legitimacy. This pretense, or public relations scheme, conceals what is really going on: the taking of property and productive time through violence. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. George Orwell. Here, political words conceal the true nature of what is going on, such as jurisdiction, constitution, nation, state, license, court, law, statute, arrest, contempt, and so forth. This does not mean that I return that violence with more violence, because I don't. I do the opposite. Do you remember how the people of India, through peaceful non-cooperation, caused the British to show their true colors? The British slave mongers had a choice. Which one was more important to them, their pretense of legitimacy and civility, or their true violent criminal nature? Apparently, it was the massive lie their government put forth they were civilized that was more important. Gandhi and his followers were able to rid themselves of the British without resorting to violence. The English exposed themselves and then left. That is how I do things. I make the bureaucrat choose between the true violent nature of his business and his pretense of legitimacy, knowing he's going to sacrifice one of them. I just hope it's for violence. Political words and opinions are used so there is a perception that bureaucrats are a wonderful, benevolent group of men and women protecting people and their property. But it's just a pretense, fraud, hoax, swindle, charade, etc. Without violence, bureaucrats would not function at all. If I took control of your life and property by force, I would be a criminal and prancing around with a silly crown, calling myself a king or a sovereign. makes it no less a vicious act. And it still won't change if I get a few friends to prostrate themselves on the ground, genuflecting and proclaiming me king. Change your perception for a moment. Look at the situation such as a traffic stop and imagine it without the legal opinions and costumes. Just look at the actions of what is really happening. This is similar to the story of Alice in Wonderland, when Alice realized the so-called queen was just a playing card. Alice just stopped accepting the mental conception that a playing card was a queen and the queen lost her power over Alice. Another example is the story of the emperor without any new clothes. The real question here is, why would you call a naked man an emperor and not a naked imbecile? A friend of mine was talking to someone on the phone who stated the Queen of England was a so-called sovereign. He asked what she was sovereign over and the guy told him the people. So he asked, what if everyone left England? As humans, we typically do three things with the messages we receive from our senses. 1, we delete. 2, add to and/or 3, distort them. Because this is not a psychology book, I will keep it simple. Consider these deletions, distortions, and additions to reality as opinions. Reality equals facts. Deletions, distortions, additions equal opinions. Every time a bureaucrat spews forth an opinion, he is deleting, distorting, and/or adding to reality. This is very important. A typical traffic stop involves a man dressed up like a cop, committing numerous crimes against his victim. I mean crimes in the lay or layman's sense of the word, not in the so-called legal sense. These are not considered to be crimes because in legal land, it's not false imprisonment, it's called an investigative detention or some equally inane political label. Nothing has changed except the label or opinion that's been added to it. The political or status legal land words cover up the real issue and distort reality. The reality that someone is taking my property through physical violence, threats, and organized coercion. Don't distort, add to, or delete anything from reality. Know who you are dealing with and don't bring a knife to a gunfight. Chapter 2. Never assume anything. I don't accept any presumptions or opinions, delete, add to, or distort things. Instead, I question everything. This tends to really irritate my wife. Whether I think I understand something or not, I question it anyway. I ask them to be responsive and explain it. I wouldn't just assume the guy who gave me a ticket is a police officer as if a person's job makes it okay to use physical violence and coercion against me. Just as important, I don't assume the cop, the primary or sole witness, understands what is going on or what he is talking about. I do not add opinions, I only look at the facts. He's a man with a gun and a costume called a uniform. Not only that, he took control of my life and property without my freely given consent. I take this to mean that he's a man with a gun who has no respect for human life, at least not while he is on the clock. In other words, his job description is to be antisocial. When I assume or accept presumptions and opinions, deletions, distortions, or additions to reality, I relieve the bureaucrats of their alleged burden of proof and make the taking of my valuable time easier for them. If that is the case, then why put up any kind of defense? Bureaucrats have to make what they do look legitimate. That is, give me so-called due process of law, a fair trial, or heaven forbid, administered justice. If the way they operate isn't seen as legitimate and fair, then people would not support them, at least not as many as do now. If people didn't support them, then they wouldn't pay taxes. Without taxes, there is no way to pay the men with machine guns to force compliance. Apathy has a strange way of doing it. Let's face it, the only real difference between what the men and women doing business as the IRS do and what a common thief does is the political label attached to it, i.e., one is legal and the other is not. Taking property by force is robbery, and the victim doesn't usually care about opinions. Whether something is legal or not is not a factual description of reality. I once asked a former IRS lawyer from Phoenix named Eric what the factual differences were between the act of stealing and the act of taxation. He initially sneered at me. That's an easy question. One is legal and the other isn't. I told him that was non-responsive. I only wanted the facts. Just before slamming the phone down, he spit out, "Okay, you're right. They're the same thing." I guess it's tough realizing you spent 18 years defending and profiting off of armed robbery. This pretense of fairness, together with the fact that violence is the nature and basis of how bureaucrats operate, form the foundation for framing a very effective method of exposing bureaucrats for who and what they really are. They will actually expose themselves. I don't have to make any arguments to say that they have no case. They will do that for me in their zeal to steal my property and productive time. Those who attack the rationale of the game and not the players are its most formidable adversaries. James J. Martin, in an introduction to Lysander Spooner's No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority. So again, the foundation for my questions are, they operate by physical violence and coercion, and they are supposed to administer justice, i.e. act in good faith, and give me a fair trial. To rational people who respect human life, these 2 points will always contradict. I ask questions to expose this contradiction. If you examine the opinions used to justify the violence, then you'll see contradiction after contradiction after contradiction. Bureaucrats don't have to answer any of my questions either. Being non-responsive also strips them of any pretense of good faith. According to their own rules, I am supposed to be informed of the nature and cause of the charges and proceedings, and they refuse to answer my questions? Doesn't look fair to me. Physical violence and justice are opposites here. In the real world, I exploit it as best I can. I have no pretenses. I know in legal land, violence and justice are soulmates. In my experience, bureaucrats have no problem using as much violence as is necessary to get compliance with their whims and opinions. It's just part of their job. No matter how much violence is used, they blame it on their victim. Yes, your husband's dead, but he had it coming. He should have had a seatbelt on, and he should have answered the officer's questions faster than he did. I think asking questions is more effective because the burden never shifts to me. Why should I have to prove anything? What if I'm accused of being the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy? Either way, they have no case. This is true even if damage is caused. If you don't believe this, let me give you some examples. Although, don't misunderstand, this is not advocating causing damage. If I bust my next-door neighbor's window, I am only responsible to him to replace his window, not some schmucks down the street. A woman telephoned me because she changed lanes without looking and damaged someone else's car. A cop then gave her a piece of paper known politically as a ticket. I asked her a few questions such as if she had insurance to cover the damage she caused. She told me she did, and the insurance company was taking care of it. I then asked her if she believed she was obligated to the cop in any way. She initially believed she was. I asked her what facts she relied on to support her legal opinion. She was unable to answer. This is because there is no obligation. I told her I would ask the cop the same question. When not permitted to delete, add to, or distort reality, bureaucratic attacks cannot be justified. Unless you've made an agreement by your individual freely given consent, then any so-called obligation is no obligation because it is based upon coercion. If this is not true, then consider the average thief on the street. If he sticks a gun in your face demanding money, are you obligated to give him your money? Even if you give him the money, are you obligated to keep giving him money months and years later if he returns? What if that same thief claims to be your sovereign and demands your genuflect after giving him your wallet? Consider this. I walk up to you and say, "Oh yeah, by the way, Frank just agreed with me that you should be my slave. I mean, citizen. We signed a contract, rather a social compact. Now come with me and start paying your fair share by scrubbing my toilets." Would you honor such a contract? Would it be a contract? For any lawyers reading this, do you really think valid obligations are created by violence and organized coercion? I wouldn't think any rational person would think so, because that would be the same as saying armed robbery is a legitimate business. However, in legal land, armed robbery is legitimate if you carry a really cool-looking metal badge and a high-sounding political title. Lysander Spooner said it best. If taxation without consent is not robbery, then any band of robbers have only to declare themselves a government, and all their robberies are legalized. Lysander Spooner, letter to Grover Cleveland. Criminals could also set up their own courts. Bandits have not usually kept supreme courts of their own to legalize either their robberies or their promises to pay for past robberies out of the proceeds of their future ones. Perhaps they may now take a lesson from our Supreme Court and establish courts of their own that will hereafter legalize all their contracts of this kind. Lysander Spooner, letter to Grover Cleveland. Having courts, lawyers, and opinions does nothing to make robbery any less of a crime. That is all political sleight of hand to delete, add to, or distort reality. Lysander Spooner was a lawyer who competed with the post office bureaucrats who eventually used violence to shut him down. I highly recommend his writings, in particular his No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority. Most can be found on the internet. My second example is that of robbery in California. I'll use car theft to illustrate. Without political opinions, theft is the taking of property by force without the owner's consent. Bureaucrats catch a man they believe took the property by force. This man is then put on trial. He is convicted and put in a cage referred to politically as a jail. The big question is, just how do the bureaucrats pay for all of this? This includes the cops, judges, clerks, detention officers, lawyers, jurors, and the cost of running a cage, jail, and feeding the hapless people stuck inside. While the political answer is taxation, the layman's answer is they take property by force. In California, that would mean taking it from over 35 million people. Incidentally, Taxation in the political sense is also the taking of property by force. However, such theft is considered legal. In other words, to punish and pay for one act of forcibly taking property, crime, bureaucrats commit the same act, crime, over 35 million times. And this does not include property forcibly taken from so-called corporations. You've heard the saying, 2 wrongs do not make a right. Well, I'd like to update that. In legal land, it's 35,000,001 wrongs do make a right. This is then hailed as justice and printed up in fancy law books. This does not mean I advocate the forcible taking of property, quite the contrary. I think robbery is always wrong, whether one is wearing a costume or not. Bureaucrats wear uniforms. Non-bureaucratic robbers wear stockings on their heads. Robbery is robbery, whether done by an individual man or ostensibly by majority vote. A good analogy is this. You have 2 children, and you don't want the older child hitting the younger child. The older child hits the younger child anyway. To punish the older child, you spank him. This is even better if, while spanking him, you yell at the child, "Haven't I told you not to hit your brother?" However, to more correctly demonstrate how bureaucrats operate, imagine the same situation, but instead of spanking the older child, you send him to his room and hit both the younger child and your spouse. You could then go door to door in your neighborhood, hitting everyone else. If anyone complains, you just tell them it's the only way to punish your older child, or it's the best system of justice in the world, and if they don't like it, complain to your congressman. Bureaucrats never have a case, despite all appearances to the contrary. If a man commits armed robbery and gives part of the money to some poor people, he is still an armed robber, and his action is no less heinous. The act itself does not change if he frolics around like a nitwit, calling himself a so-called sovereign. In legal land, theft is okay. Armed robbery is SOP, standard operating procedure. This will be shown in greater depth later on. For now, I just want to point out the following. This will show theft is considered okay with a cool-looking badge and an antisocial attitude. Quote, a person commits theft if, without lawful authority, such person knowingly controls property of another with the intent to deprive him of such property. Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 13-1802. Close quote. Only in legal land can the exact same act be a crime and not a crime. This is a classic example of distorting and adding to reality. Let's see what happens when we unravel this example of bureaucratic reasoning to see how far it extends. Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 13-1105. First-degree murder classification. A person commits first-degree murder if, without lawful authority, intending or knowing that the person's conduct will cause death, the person causes the death of another with premeditation. Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 13-1508. Burglary in the first degree classification. A person commits burglary in the first degree if, without lawful authority, such person or an accomplice violates the provisions of either Section 13-1506 or 13-1507 and knowingly possesses explosives, a deadly weapon, or a dangerous instrument in the course of committing any theft or any felony. Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 13-1410. Molestation of child classification. A. A person commits molestation of a child if, without lawful authority, by intentionally or knowingly engaging in or causing a person to engage in sexual contact, except sexual contact with the female breast, with a child under 15 years of age. B. Molestation of a child is a Class 2 felony that is punishable pursuant to Section 13-604.01. Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 13-1904, Armed Robbery Classification. A. A person commits armed robbery if, without lawful authority, in the course of committing robbery as defined in Section 13-1902, such person or accomplice, 1. is armed with a deadly weapon or a simulated deadly weapon, or 2. uses or threatens to use a deadly weapon or dangerous instrument or a simulated deadly weapon. B. Armed robbery is a Class 2 felony. Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 13-2903, Riot Classification. A. A person commits riot if, without lawful authority, with 2 or more other persons acting together, such person recklessly uses force or violence or threatens to use force or violence, if such threat is accompanied by immediate power of execution, which disturbs the public peace. B. Riot is a Class 5 felony. And finally, Arizona Revised Statute, Section 13-1402, Indecent Exposure Classification. A. A person commits indecent exposure if, without lawful authority, he or she exposes his or her genitals or anus or she exposes the areola or nipple of her breast or breasts, and another person is present, and the defendant is reckless about whether such other person, as a reasonable person, would be offended or alarmed by the act. This has special applicability to former presidents. While there may be a generous amount of sarcasm here to make a point, think about this. What is more damaging to people, theft or indecent exposure? Which one would you prefer to see licensed? Asking questions can be a very effective way of getting to the truth. It's how we learn. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I know. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. Rudyard Kipling. I think if a person is afraid to ask a cop or a judge some questions, then it may just be that part of them is already convinced they are not dealing with a benevolent individual. If someone has a problem answering a few questions, then there are only one of two things going on. The individual has no answers, or the individual is withholding the answer. In either case, it is difficult at best to maintain a perception of legitimacy. This is the case if a bureaucrat gets angry with you for doing no more than asking a question. What kind of individual threatens a man with violence, such as contempt, for doing no more than that? When tyrants cannot prevail by deceit, they burst into open rage. Geneva Bible, Note I, Exodus 1:22. I helped a man in Washington with a criminal traffic case. The cop claimed this man was within the state. When he asked the cop what facts he would base this opinion on, the judge said the witness could not testify, and if any more questions like that were asked, he would have this man held in contempt. This, of course, is legal land speak for having an armed man violently place him into a cage for the vicious crime of asking a question. It's similar to saying collateral damage for the cold-blooded murder of men and women and children known politically as civilians. Can you imagine a law making it a crime to ask a bureaucratic question? Take the robe off the judge and imagine the same thing in a slightly different context. I'll use Sears as an example because it can be extremely difficult for people to stop deleting from, adding to, or distorting reality. In other words, just changing the name from City of Phoenix to Sears can help to negate all your previous conditioning, at least for the sake of this illustration. You're at Sears, and an employee, cop, pulls a gun on you claiming you cannot leave Sears because you owe Sears $500. You say you don't understand why he has made this claim, so he gets upset and calls other employees, backup, and his manager, the judge. The employee tells the manager you owe Sears $500 and you refuse to pay. You then ask the employee to tell you what facts led him to believe you owe $500. What did you allegedly purchase? The manager then yells that the employee cannot answer, and if you ask any more questions like that, you are going to be held against your will. Jail. If you look at what happens in a traffic case, if all you do is replace the name with Sears, then you may start to see the true nature of what is happening. Here's another example. I helped someone in Sacramento. The judge was an older man named Joe. Joe refused to allow me to help this person at all. Joe threatened me with physical violence, contempt, if I spoke. And mind you, this was not to Joe, but just quietly conferring with the man I was helping. How is that friendly social behavior? Would you cage a human being for speaking? After the hearing, I politely told Joe, I think your threats were unprofessional and unwarranted. Joe was not pleased and called a deputy to throw me out of his courtroom. Outside the courtroom, I spoke with the man I was helping and opposing counsel. This armed deputy approached me again and told me I had to leave the building now. I said I was talking to someone and wasn't ready to leave. This armed man then threatened to arrest me if I did not leave. I asked him why and said, am I in contempt of the building now? He made an approach and I told him to back off because I was leaving. As I was leaving, I asked who the presiding judge was and where his courtroom was. It was a lawyer named Parks and he was across the street. I found out Judge Parks was on the 6th floor and we got into the elevator. Before the doors shut, 2 cops running full speed got into the elevator with us. We spoke to them and learned that they were on a call up to the 6th floor. Along the way, another cop who ran to the elevator got on. At the 6th floor, all 3 cops ran out and were joined by 2 more cops. We walked out and followed them because we had learned in the elevator that they too were headed to Judge Parks' courtroom. As it turned out, they were called about me, though they were still unaware. After looking around for a few minutes, totally confused because there was no perp around, the youngest cop eventually asked me if I was thrown out of the building across the street. I answered yes. He asked me who threw me out and I said, Joe. This cop looked very puzzled and asked who Joe was. I said, he's the guy who wears a black robe and sits 4 feet off the floor. For some reason, this really upset him and he snapped back, you mean the judge? I replied that I don't look at Joe as a judge. To me, he's just Joe. I was escorted out of the building, and all I wanted to do was speak to the presiding judge regarding my getting thrown out of the first building for no reason. However, just referring to the judge as Joe had a profound psychological effect on this cop. And why is that? Because he was no longer following the judge's orders, just Joe's. Not too easy to justify violence in the name of Joe, is it? There are several other points of interest here. I was thrown out of the building across the street by Joe. Despite 5 cops running full bore to Judge Parks, no incident report was filed, and Joe was not brought up on charges by anyone for calling in a false report to the police. Say what you want about being thrown out of a courtroom, let the baby have his courtroom, but to also be thrown out of the building as well? And what about the building across the street? Exactly how far outside the courtroom does this superhuman power called contempt extend anyway? Maybe World War II could have been avoided by having a traffic court judge declare Hitler to be in contempt. Notice, too, I was in the elevator with the cops, and they had no idea I was the object of their call. I must have been a real subtle threat that even the discerning eye of professional law enforcement could not pick up. And why no incident report? Probably because there was no incident, at least not caused by me. I spoke to the captain of those 5 courageous cops the next day, and he asked why I didn't speak to him the previous day while in Sacramento. I told him, frankly, sir, because here in Arizona, I'm out of range of your guns, that's why. Last, Joe was not brought up on any charges of calling in a false police report. If I had done that, you can rest assured, I would have been charged and convicted in short order. But why not Joe? My lay opinion, based on years of experience dealing with bureaucrats, is the law is not applicable to bureaucrats, while it is applicable to the productive of society they seek to rape, pillage, and plunder. I've also provided the California Attorney General's office with documentary evidence of felonies committed by lawyers and have never gotten so much as a letter of acknowledgement. You would think that they would want to arrest me for filing a false report. In either case, a felony was committed. So much for their zealous enforcement of the law. It is also interesting to note the Judicial Conduct Commission did absolutely nothing with my complaint about Joe. Chapter 3. Never disagree with him. Zen in the art of litigation. I believe this is critical. I don't want these people ticked off at me any more than they already are. I could go to jail or worse. While I have been threatened with contempt many times, I have not been thrown in jail for it. However, I do not think going into court and being argumentative is effective. If I disagree with a judge and tell him he's wrong, he's just going to sneer at me. You can appeal. If I keep disagreeing with him, then he's probably going to start threatening me with physical violence and contempt. The result is that I do not
you got to back out of it, so on.
Accomplishes anything positive.
Are you there?
It only gets me labeled argumentative, and I am viewed as an opponent. Bureaucrats already view non-bureaucrats, productive people, as the enemy, so I don't want to help confirm his opinion. This
trying
is
to get
a very real us and them attitude of bureaucrats.
If anybody watches this and they know how to get
an argument with them doesn't do me
PayPal
any
button,
good, and that might cause me harm. I know this from personal experience, having known many people who are or were cops. If a judge snaps he has jurisdiction over me, then I don't tell him he's wrong. As will be shown below, that's an opinion the judge can deny. It's far more effective to just ask him to explain factually where, when, why, and how his so-called jurisdiction over me was acquired. I want to know where, when, why, and how it happened so I can possibly avoid it in the future. I put the burden where it belongs, on the unproductive individual seeking to forcibly take my productive time. I call this Zen in the art of litigation. I am no longer the opponent. It's pitting the bureaucrat against himself. There is no fighting, arguing, or other resistance, just asking for the facts and watching the bureaucrat's confidence collapse along with his presented case. He may still be violent, but his confidence is declining steadily. It could probably be a mathematical formula, whereas a bureaucrat's confidence drops, his level of anger and violence rises. A very effective question in this regard, and one I've never had a responsive answer to, is this. Except for physical violence, how was your alleged jurisdiction over me acquired? This question may not be denied or rejected because there is nothing to deny. The judge has two choices here, as with any question. He is either responsive or he is not. If he's not, I don't really care, because then he's showing his true colors. In a sense, without answering, he is answering. He could just keep refusing to be responsive. That's okay. Every time he does this, his pretense of good faith and fairness wears a little thinner, as does the patience of anyone taking his charade seriously. And that is the point here anyway. I cannot actually win. I'm in damage control, and I can only frame and ask questions designed to cause him to damage his pretense of good faith by not being responsive. This is a no-win situation for the cop and the judge. The questions are framed to box them in and expose the fact that there is no case against me, unless baseless legal opinions, political gibberish, and fantasies constitute a case. Of course, despite no evidence or even a hint